Good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you for joining us for virtual programming during Metropolitan Community College's summer quarter. My name is Cynthia Gooch Grayson, and I serve the college as the Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion. Today, we begin our Juneteenth observance. Juneteenth, which is short for June 19th, marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and to ensure that all enslaved people were freed. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth honors the end to slavery in the United States and is the longest running African-American holiday. On June 17th, 2021, just last year, it officially became a federal holiday. Your microphones will be silenced today. Please use the chat function to send communication to myself, the moderator, and I will present your questions to our speaker after his presentation. You can also watch the chat for a link to an online evaluation later or throughout our time together this morning. Dr. Ronald C Mccurdy, we are happy to welcome him back, first of all. He is the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Professor of Music in the Thornton School of Music at the University of Southern California, USC, where he has served as chair of the Jazz Department for 6 years. He has served as a consultant to the Grammy Foundation and the Walt Disney All-American College Band. Mr. McCurdy, or Dr. McCurdy, excuse me, continues to tour the Langston Hughes Project, which we were blessed to have that opportunity here on campus. Many of you may have witnessed that wonderful performance. This multimedia presentation is based on Langston Hughes' poem, Ask Your Mama, 12 Moods for Jazz. In 2008, he premiered the orchestral version of the Langston Hughes Project with the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra with rapper and television actor Ice-T. McCurdy has also created or co-created 2 other interdisciplinary productions to include Letters from Zora Neale Hurston, and Shanghai's Jazz, a cultural mix. McCurdy is the co-author of The Artist Entrepreneur, Finding Success in a New Arts Economy. He is co-author of a vocal jazz improvisation series titled Approaching the Standards. McCurdy authored Meet the Great Jazz Legends. He contributed chapters to 2 recent publications, Teaching Music and Performance Through Jazz, Volume 1, and African Americans in Popular Culture. Dr. McCurdy is a performing artist for the Yamaha International Corporation. Please welcome back to MCC, first time virtually, but a friend of the college, Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy, for his presentation, How Did Emancipation Really Affect the Enslaved African? Dr. McCurdy.
Thank you so very, very much for that wonderful introduction. I was thinking, who is she talking about? How could one person have done all those things? But I'm honored to have a chance to come back and have this conversation with your students, faculty, and staff. So again, thank you for the invitation. Please allow me to share my screen and we'll get ourselves started here. I must tell you, it's a little early here in California, but that's okay. This is what we do. Okay, can you all see my screen okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. So, in that beautiful introduction, we heard a wonderful explanation for this celebration we call Juneteenth. One important thing that I think is important to note is that we call it Freedom Day. Freedom Day. And what I would like to do this morning is kind of give us help us connect the dots on how we got to emancipation and how Juneteenth became a part of that and what happened after emancipation. I think it's always good to connect those dots. I teach courses here at the University of Southern California, and I always tell my students, my role as a professor is not to change your mind, but to expand it. I also tell my students that in this class we're not going to Disneyize any of this
Mm.
historical information. We're going to tell the truth. We're not here to victimize anyone. We're not here to accuse anyone of anything. So, with that spirit, we dive in. And I would also say, as students, I like for my students to challenge me. Don't take my word as the gospel. Do your own research, and we can have these kinds of conversations that will hopefully lead to a better understanding of how we as a country evolved. But before we dig in, let me just kind of give you a sense of who I am again. It was said that I am a professor of music here at USC and also assistant dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'm also the son of two extraordinary parents who have since been called to glory. But while they were here and while I was fortunate enough to have them, they instilled in me a real sense of strong ethical values, and that is to lead a life of service. So even though I am a musician and an educator, everything that I do, it is done within the spirit of being of service or being in service to other people. I grew up in a small town called Belglade, Florida. And this particular town was a migratory town where 80% of the population were African Americans, most of whom were migrants. If you look at the photograph on the right side, it says, "Welcome to Belglade, her soil is her fortune." And what that meant was Belglade was this agricultural town where the soil was so fertile, you could drop a seed in the ground and the next couple of days something would be growing. There were literally hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane, corn, celery, you name it, and they had to have cheap labor to harvest those crops. When my parents moved to Belglade in 1946, the top left-hand photograph is how most of the black folks lived who were the farm workers in Belglade. It was very arduous task to work. You worked 12-hour days for very little pay. When my parents moved to Belgrade, my father was a high school principal, by the way, and my mother taught third grade. When they moved to Belgrade in 1946, the schools for the black students only extended to the fifth grade. The thinking was, why should we invest money into educating these little black kids when they're going to assume the same role as their parents when they become adults? So that was the thinking. My father knew Mary McLeod Bethune, and he asked her, and Mary McLeod Bethune knew Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady. She approached her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and asked if he would allocate funding to allow the schools in the South to extend to the 12th grade. So by 1955, there was the first graduating class in Belglade at Lakeshore High School in 1955, when my father was the principal. You can see the bottom photograph is a person working harvesting the sugar cane. And I mentioned again, it was hard work. My father, as principal, recognized that education was going to be the key for any kind of upward mobility. In addition to educating the students, he also instituted what was called night school. And this is where he educated the parents. The parents were able to get their high school diplomas. So he recognized the importance of education, and that was his legacy, and I guess it kind of rubbed off on me, and I became an educator as well. I mention this because Belglade, I was born before the Civil Rights Act was enacted, which meant that we lived in a very segregated society. Where I grew up, there were two separate swimming pools in the town. There were two separate high schools. There were two separate counters at the Dairy Queen. Same ice cream, same server, but two separate windows to order your ice cream. There were two separate waiting rooms at the doctor's office. And I mention this because this was probably the first time that I recognized that my complexion would have an impact on how I was treated. My parents did their best to insulate me and my siblings from any kind of racist behavior, but it was inevitable because we were living in a very segregated society. And I remember being as a child, maybe around 6 or 7 years old, going to the doctor's office, and all the doctors were white in our town. And the waiting rooms for the white patients was air conditioned. It had nice furniture. and it had nice magazines sprawled across the tabletops. The black waiting room had dilapidated furniture, no air condition, and no magazines. And I remember asking my mother, "So, Mom, why do we have to sit over here? It's hot. Can we go sit over there?" And she said, "No, baby, we can't sit over there." And I think that was the first time it hit me that my race, my complexion, my pigmentation would have an impact on how we were treated. So at that point forward, I mean, even as a child, I began to recognize and see the disparities between how people were being treated. So that has been a part of my work as a musician, as an educator, to really help educate people, as my parents did for me and my siblings. Now, I want to offer just a brief overview to kind of help us understand how we got to the need for emancipation. And what is emancipation? First of all, we know that the Americas initially was a British colony. There were poor Europeans as well as Africans who came to this country as indentured servants, meaning that you would work for a certain period of time and then you would be set free. Both African and Europeans were exploited by the wealthy planters, those who had already, and when you think about how Great Britain, the Portuguese, Spain, the French were all looking to expand their empires. They were people like Christopher Columbus, whom we lionize as being this great discoverer, when in fact, historically, he was more like a pirate. He would go to places, he would rape and pillage and claim the land in the name of the king and queen. And disregarding those indigenous people who were already there. I often tell students, Christopher Columbus, what he did would be like the same thing as me coming to your dorm room or your apartment or your home and seeing your wallet on the dresser and saying, "Oh, look what I just discovered," and claiming it as your own. This is basically what happened. So, with this kind of expansion, the planters were looking for ways to expand, their financial situation. And they needed to have cheap or free labor to harvest their cotton, their tobacco, their indigo. So poor Europeans and Africans were both exploited. By the middle of the 17th century, right around 1650, it became clear that the African was going to be the enslaved and the Europeans were going to be the enslavers. This is where and when the whole social construct of whiteness was invented. Prior to this time, you were recognized by your nationality. You were French, you were Spanish, you were British or English, you were German, you were Russian, you were Swedish, but you were not, there was no such thing as being white. So what the planters had to do, they had to figure out a way to divide and conquer. They convinced the poor Europeans, "We're going to let you be a part of this white club, but we're not going to give you any land or any property or any wealth, but you get to be one of us. Oh, and by the way, the reasons for your downtrodden ways is because of these black and brown people." So we can begin to see how the whole idea of divide and conquer became very much a part of our fabric. This country was founded on white supremacy. White supremacy. So that was the blueprint that our founding fathers gave us. As we became a country, we know from 1776 we got our independence from Great Britain, and our founding fathers gave us this blueprint that was absolutely brilliant. It was democracy. They did not want a king or a queen or a monarchy. They wanted a democracy. And they said in these words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Now, they said those words, or they wrote those words, but they really didn't mean it. What they really meant was all wealthy white men, land-owning white men are created equal. Which is why today, if we fast forward to where we are now, even during emancipation, during Reconstruction, the whole idea of deciding who gets the right to vote has always been called into question. So we can see how at the very beginning, this was a problem. And I can tell you when the founding fathers never looked upon people of African descent as being equal. So it never crossed their mind that these people would ever have the audacity to think that they could have a say-so in how this country would unfold. So we go through this period where the president, even the first president, George Washington, he understood that the country could not sustain itself when a certain segment of the population was enslaved. So what did he do? On his dying bed, he had bequeathed upon his death that all of his slaves would be set free. Upon his wife's death, Martha, upon her death, her slaves would be set free. So what does Martha do when George Washington dies? And the enslaved Africans knew that once she died, they would be free. So they were asking her on a regular basis, Martha, how you feel today? You feeling okay? Because they knew they would be free once she died. So it was just a dire situation to put her in. So what does she do? She frees her enslaved Africans before she passes away, because she didn't want to be living in a situation on Monticello, looking at these enslaved Africans, thinking that they're asking her about her health and wondering when she's going to die. So anyway, that's what we were dealing with. Now, to understand the slave trade, we can see that the majority of the enslaved Africans came from the west coast of Africa. You can see Sierra Leone, you can see the Congo, you can see Ghana. These were some of the countries where people of African descent came to be enslaved Africans in South America, Mexico, North America, and including parts of Canada, and also parts of Europe. And I must remind you all that slavery, first and foremost, was a business. It became the cornerstone of New World economics. It was more profitable with the selling and trading of human bodies than it was other kinds of goods. Africa was a prize. There was seemingly an inexhaustible supply of bodies. On the long, arduous Middle Passage, as it was referred to, it would take sometime up to 6 months to travel from West Africa to the Americas. And along the way, sometimes a third of the, and I use air quotes, cargo died because they couldn't survive the journey. You can see at the bottom left, the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch were all involved in the slave trade. All these countries profited from the slave trade. Much of the wealth that Great Britain has right now is due to the slave trade. The wealth that America has right now was due to the slave trade. The wealth in the West Indies, Antigua, Cuba, Jamaica, all these islands, Santo Domingo, Haiti, all profited from the slave trade. Now, this is a very painful photograph to look at, but it gives you a sense of how Africans were packed. You can see those little black dots represent bodies, and they were shackled to the bottom of a slave ship. They would be brought up every couple of days to be hosed off and to get some exercise, and then it would be put back in this very shackled position. You can see the examples on the left represent the first and second floor. So if you were on the bottom floor, or on the second floor, when you had your bodily functions would occur, it would simply just drop down on those below you. And imagine being in that state for up to 6 months sometimes. It was the most despicable experience one could imagine, but this is how Africans were transported from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. I want to mention this is something that happened around 1820. This was during what was called the antebellum period. The antebellum refers to before the Civil War. There was a thing called blackface minstrelsy. It was started by a guy by the name of King Daddy Rice, or Thomas Dartmouth Rice. And what he did, he put together a whole theatrical presentation that was based on an enslaved African who was owned by a Mr. Crow. And the routine was he would have put on these tattered clothing, and this enslaved African who was owned by Mr. Crow had a physical deformity. But he would do this little jig dance, and Thomas Dartmouth Rice called it Jump Jim Crow. That was the name of his show, and it became immensely popular. People all over the country began to come to watch these shows that Thomas Dartmouth Rice put together. Eventually, there were a plethora of others who were emulating this whole idea of blackface minstrelsy. Now, this example I have on the screen right now, Billy Van. This is Billy Van on the left and on the right. Whites would put black cork in their face. They would accentuate the size of their lips. They would bulge their eyes, and they would, change their hair to basically promote and propagate these negative stereotypes of African people. And the stereotypes were usually someone being, dim-witted, lazy, violators of law. I mean, all the negative stereotypes you could imagine they were perpetuating. However, there was even one part that's even more sad about this story. We had African Americans or Africans around this same time who began to imitate whites who were imitating blacks who were imitating whites again. So we had this kind of behavior taking place, which was horrific, but it was a way of escaping the vicissitudes of slavery. This also set the wheels in motion for African Americans being in the entertainment business. I mean, in addition to our working in the fields, if you could sing or dance or make a mockery of yourself in some way or another, this was a better life for you than it would have been if you were toiling away in the field. So again, we had African Americans or Africans being a part of this minstrelsy. The difficult part about blackface minstrelsy is that those stereotypes begin to ferment into the fabric of America. It became the way that African Americans were looked upon. No matter who you were associated with this Jim Crow character that Thomas Dartmouth Rice had created. So no matter what your name was, you were called Jim Crow. Later on, the term Jim Crow would be attached to Jim Crow laws, meaning laws that were assigned or attached to African Americans to keep them in place, Jim Crow laws. Now, getting into our talk about emancipation, how do we define emancipation? What were the dimensions of emancipation? The significance of Juneteenth? The long-term and short-term effects of emancipation? Some of the remnants of emancipation? And then the connection between emancipation and the convict leasing programs, and also the mass incarceration of African Americans. Now, when we define emancipation, the act of being freed from restraint, control, or the power of another, especially to free from bondage, the meaning of it within the context of the history of the United States is the abolishment of slavery. So we're talking about the abolitionists who were a part of abolishing slavery. Now, when we think of emancipation, we immediately think about President Abraham Lincoln coming up with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, January 1st. But I must let you know that there were other forms of emancipation that took place long before then. One took place during the Revolutionary War. Lord Dunsmore in 1775 offered freedom to any enslaved African who would fight on the side of the British. And of course, there were quite a few enslaved Africans who took Lord Dunsmore up on his offer, who fought on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War. There was a thing called self-emancipation. One that comes to mind would be the Stono Rebellion in 1739, where a group of Angolan slaves decided they didn't like being free. And I should mention this. At no point did any enslaved African enjoy being enslaved. We can look at propaganda movies like Gone with the Wind, which paint a very rosy picture of slavery. You see the little slaves, frolicking on the plantations, and everybody's happy and singing and sitting around and having a good time. That was not the case at all. At no point was anybody content being enslaved. We had the conspiracy of 1741 in New York, Gabriel's conspiracy in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, the German coast uprisings near New Orleans in 1811, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, both of whom were preachers in Charleston, South Carolina, and Southampton, Virginia, respectively. These were all uprisings. These were all individuals who were self-emancipated. Now let's get to Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln. We know in our history books that we always, again, lionize Abraham Lincoln as being the great emancipator, and he was. But I must tell you, Abraham Lincoln did not have some kind of moral epiphany by saying, boy, we've been wrong all these years by keeping these black folks enslaved. That is not what he was thinking. He enacted Emancipation Proclamation out of economic and political expediency. He recognized this was in the midst of the Civil War. The Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. So in the midst of the Civil War, he enacted Emancipation Proclamation. He did so to put an economic chokehold on the South by relieving them of their free labor system. And if you're going to be involved in wars, it costs money. And we're seeing this now with supplying Ukraine with arms to fight against Russia. It's cost us billions of dollars. So it's very expensive to be in war. So if you can't have someone to pick your cotton and your tobacco, then you don't have the money to finance your war. That was Abraham Lincoln's thinking. He also said, if I can free some of the enslaved Africans, I'll do so in order to keep the Union together. If I don't have to free any of the enslaved Africans, I'll do that too if I can keep the Union together. So his whole idea was about keeping the Union together. We know we begin to see certain states succeed from the Union. North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, one by one succeeded from the Union. And this is what launched the Civil War. So Lincoln convened a group of black clergymen to come to the White House to talk about how we're going to deal with these soon-to-be freed enslaved Africans. His first idea was to engage in what we call self-deportation. In other words, they would send themselves out of the United States and go back either to Africa or to the West Indies, but anywhere but here. The black clergyman said, Mr. President, with all due respect, we are Americans too. We helped to build this country. We are not going anywhere. We're staying here. So this is a non-starter. We're not leaving this country. And they didn't. So this is where the whole idea came up of 40 acres and a mule. We were living in an agrarian society. So the thinking was if we give each family 40 acres and one mule, they can sort of form their own life. They can begin to live and have a great life. Now, as was said in the introduction, Emancipation Proclamation was January 1st, 1863, but it was some 2.5 years later that the enslaved Africans in Galveston, Texas learned that they were free. So they had been working for another 2.5 years after Emancipation Proclamation. So we see how the whole idea of the federal troops coming down to Galveston saying, you're free. You mean we're free? We're free to go? Yes. Now, we understand what happened in 1865 around this time. Abraham Lincoln goes to a play. Bad idea for that particular idea. He was assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president. He was his vice president. Andrew Johnson, for all that he was no friend to the enslaved or now freed African. He repealed what was known as Field Order 15. No 40 acres of land and no mule. So now you've got all of these Africans, freed Africans, African Americans now, because they're free, living, but no place to go. Imagine being incarcerated for all of your life as an adult, and you're 45, 50 years old. You have no money, you have no resources, no education, but you're free. You've got to figure out, how am I going to live? This was the predicament that the just freed Africans found themselves in. Now, we begin to move to what we call Reconstruction. And this was probably the first time that what the founding fathers had in mind actually worked. We had a mayor, we had governors of Louisiana, we had people, African Americans, serving in all different levels of government, from local government, regional, state, and even the Congress and the Senate. Here are a few examples of people: Senator Hiram Revels from Mississippi, House of Representatives Benjamin Turner from Alabama, Josiah Walls from Florida. These were all African Americans who were serving and functioning and taking part in our government processes. As you might imagine, for every action, there's a reaction. This emboldened the Ku Klux Klan because, again, the South lost the war, but they didn't lose their Southern proclivities. They were very upset about having lost their free labor system, and they were determined to put African Americans back in some form of slavery. Now, things were going well. African Americans were voting, and when you can vote, you get what you see on your screen right now: Black members of Congress, mayors, people working on the school boards, working as city councilmen. You have people working, as I mentioned, in all different levels of government. But the Ku Klux Klan was determined not to have that go on too long. They began to perpetuate their terroristic acts by lynching and burning, and we learned about about the Tulsa Black Wall Street being burned out in 1921. That didn't just start then. Rosewood in Florida burned to the ground, killed women and children and a host of people. So they were determined to terrorize Black folks and keep them from voting. Does that sound familiar to you for today? It was always about who had the right to vote. So by the end of Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, we had gone from hundreds of thousands of African Americans voting to only a few thousand because they were afraid to vote. Voting could get you killed, or trying to vote could get you killed. So all of a sudden, African Americans were shut out of the whole democratic process. And things got worse because now all of a sudden, we ended up having what was called the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. However, there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment. And it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except, and this is the loophole, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Meaning if you are convicted of a crime, you can be thrown back into incarceration. And I ask you, guess who got to decide what was criminal? In the case of the African American, vagrancy became the crime of choice. And vagrancy meant you couldn't prove that where you were living and where you were working. And you were thrown in jail for 90 days. However, Mr. Charlie, who owned the mine or the plantation, would come and pay your bail, and you would be beholden to him for those 90 days. But by right around day 84, 85, guess what? You would be rearrested. Now, in this case, there was no cost. I mean, it didn't cost the people who were having these now incarcerated African Americans working. They were working for free because they were considered convicts. They were in cahoots with the jails. The jails were paid $12 a month per prisoner, and so you can see they were incentivized to arrest people. If you couldn't prove where you worked, where you lived, you were arrested, and this became a part of the whole peonage system. The 14th Amendment made you a naturalized citizen of the United States, regardless of if you were born in America. And we have this problem again today. If you were born here, then you are an American, which is why we're having such a difficult time with our immigration policies, because people were accusing people from Mexico from coming to America just to have a child so that child could be considered an American. That became a problem for many folks. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment gave every person, African Americans, the right to vote in 1870. All this took place during Reconstruction. Now, it becomes even more complicated because during when Ulysses Grant, who was our 18th president, when his term expired, Rutherford B. Hayes won the election. It was a very highly contested election. So a deal was made with the South. And the South said, we will let Rutherford B. Hayes become president if you agree to remove the federal troops from the South. There were troops from the Union Army who were in the South to protect the recently released African slaves. Once the troops were removed, because that was the agreement, it emboldened the Ku Klux Klan even more so to terrorize, to make sure that African Americans would be treated as second, third, and fourth class citizens. The North and the South reconciled. They both agreed that African Americans should not be looked upon as equal. They embraced, as you can see my second bullet, as black inferiority. They formed another kind of slavery. And there's a wonderful documentary by Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name. And what this does, it talks about how, as a country, during this period between 1877 up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, almost another century and almost another 100 years, we lived in a society where African Americans were treated as second, third, and fourth class citizens. Lynchings were happening almost daily. This is where the whole notion of Black Lives Matter became important, even though that term had not been used yet, because there had never been any question about the validity or the value of white lives. A black person could be killed with impunity. There were no consequences for killing a black person. To give you an example, you all know the name Emmett Till. In 1955, Emmett Till was visiting his relatives down in Money, Mississippi. He was from Chicago. His mother had warned him about the South is different. You be careful. You keep your head down. You don't look a white man in the eye. You say yes sir, no sir. You don't do anything to bring attention to yourself. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy, allegedly whistled at a white woman. A few days later, the white woman's husband and brother-in-law abducted 14-year-old Emmett Till, and the next time they saw him or his body, it was floating in a river, mutilated. Had been shot, had been stabbed. I mean, it was just a bloated. And Mamie Till, his mother, when she learned what had happened to her son, she insisted on having an open casket so the world could see what they had done to her boy. And many historians look at that moment as being a moment that helped to reignite the civil rights movement. You know, because there was no protection. It was illegal to be segregated. It was, and the men who actually killed Emmett Till, they were brought to trial, but they were acquitted. The jury acquitted them in less than an hour. Even though there was a plethora of evidence, they were acquitted. And one of the jurors said, we would have done it quicker, but we stopped for a Coca-Cola break. So that gives you an idea of just how the value of African American lives were looked upon at that time. And even one could argue that things have not changed very much. I talked about Jim Crow laws. I just talked about King Daddy Rice. We begin to see Jim Crow laws enacted. And Jim Crow laws were designed to keep black people in place, where they could live, where they could work, the amount of education they could receive. It was limited. And it became, it was a very difficult time for black folks to live. I talked to you about the penis convict leasing program and sharecropping, which was another manifestation of this post-Reconstruction era, where sharecropping would be where black families would live on white people's plantations. And the idea was that they would work the land, and when it came time to harvest the crops, they would share, air quotes again, share in the profits. Unfortunately, the scenario would go something like this. Well, you know, Mr. Ron, or not Mr., you know, Ron, we didn't do so well at the market this year. Besides, your boy killed one of my mules, and your missus got sick, and we had to get medicine from the commissary. So you owe me $150. So it became a no-win situation. And if you tried to leave the plantations, guess what? You would be arrested. So it was forced labor, is what it was. Here's an example. Here's a short excerpt from Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. This gives you a sense of how young men and women were abducted and forced back into some form of slavery.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McCree and they's been working him in prison for 12 months. I asked him to let me have him, but he won't let him go.
For a period of nearly 80 years, between the Civil War and World War II, black Southerners were no longer slaves. but they were not yet free. In one of the most shameful and little-known chapters of American history, generations of black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
From almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The Old South and what was quickly becoming the New South could not proceed without the work of African Americans.
But if you had something for free in the past, you don't necessarily want to pay for it now.
It was a straight, simple, exploitative system. There was only power, there was only force, and there was only brutality.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. The depth of poverty, the inability of African Americans to access any of the mechanisms of wealth achievement and growth are all rooted in this terroristic kind of regime that existed in so many places.
Their ability to have what we call the American dream. That is what has been stolen from black folks all through the South. And that legacy has to be understood so that people will be able to speak to it and give our ancestors voice.
Yes. Painful to watch that. But again, I wanted you to have an understanding of if you ever wondered why there's such a disparity in income and wealth between African Americans and white Americans, we can look at this period as being one of the primary examples of that. We also know about the Great New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt put in place after World War II. And sadly, many of the perks from that did not trickle down to African Americans. For example, the GI Bill. The GI Bill allowed people to get loans from banks at a very low rate. It allowed one to go to college. I mean, there are all kinds of opportunities for veterans and whites to gain some kind of upward mobility. Those opportunities were denied in terms of African Americans. African Americans could not take advantage of those opportunities. And therefore, you see the whole wealth gap explode even more so. People often say, well, why can't these people pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And the response is, first of all, you need to have boots in order to have the straps. This is where we were. Now, in the 1920s, we began to see what was called the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the progenitors of this particular movement was W.E.B. Du Bois. And the idea was that all freedom fighters like Du Bois, like Frederick Douglass, like many others, would talk about, would ask America to embrace its own words. We don't want any special privileges, America. We simply want to be treated like everyone else. And you said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. If that's the case, treat us equally. So we begin to see a much more vigilant African-American demanding their civil rights. It took a while for it to happen. This was back in around 1914, you can see, during World War I. We begin to see African-Americans who fought in World War I come home and recognizing that what they were fighting for in terms of freedom, those same freedoms were not afforded to them. World War II, the same thing, fighting for freedom, but coming home and being subjected to Jim Crow laws. And in fact, it was almost kind of a shaming of America because America was talking about the importance of freedom, and it was other countries that pointed out, said, well, America, you're not one to point the finger because look how you treat your African citizens. So don't talk to us about freedom when you yourself are involved in demeaning and incarcerating and treating a certain segment of your population as if they're not equal. So in many ways, America was shamed by that. And that helped, believe it or not, that helped to move the civil rights movement forward. We know by the 1960s, when John F. Kennedy was about to move forward, Martin Luther King, a young charismatic preacher, was talking about social justice. That November, I think it was November 22nd, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. President Johnson, or Vice President Johnson, became the president. And he was from Texas. He was not someone who necessarily embraced this whole idea of freedom, but it was President Johnson who was able to negotiate with Congress and get the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act passed, and the Housing Rights passed, which in effect helped to abolish the kind of segregation that we had experienced since the Reconstruction period. So you had people like Marcus Garvey, you had intellectuals like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, and a host of others who were writing about the plight of the African American. We had the emergence of our HBCUs, our historically black colleges and universities. And I should point out that not all whites were against African Americans having some sense of equality. For example, Howard University in Washington, D.C. is named after General Howard, who fought for the North. Think about Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It's named after a white philanthropist who put up the seed money to launch Fisk University. So there were a lot of whites who were also intricately involved in the freedom of African Americans, but life was extremely difficult. I mentioned the social programs. Now, between 1900 and 1920, there were 10 million poor, illiterate blacks and whites. But as I mentioned, the government began to institute these programs, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president, had these social programs to uplift everybody: healthcare, roads, schools, etc. But those programs, as you can see from my fifth bullet, only benefited white citizens. This helped to expand the gap. I mentioned the whole hypocrisy that Japan called out. And this was very important because all of a sudden, this kind of got Teddy Roosevelt's attention. I have another short video and then we'll take some questions here.
My boy entered an advertisement in our post paper for a job. They are being guarded all night by armed guards and not allowed to write home. Please don't send this letter back, because I'm afraid if they find out I've written to you, they'll kill my boy. Viola Cosley.
Nearly 80 years had passed since the United States ratified the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, in December 1941, President Roosevelt took steps to finally enforce it. Just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's Attorney General issued Circular 3591. It said that federal attorneys were to aggressively prosecute any case of involuntary servitude or slavery, not only those defined as peonage.
He says whether they're being held there because of a threat of imprisonment or out of violence, whatever the mechanism is that is holding people in slavery, you should go after it. And he says this is part of the war effort. These cases are important because we need to make sure that African Americans feel like their rights are being taken care of.
And within months, there was a prosecution underway of a man in Texas who had been holding an African American worker as a slave for almost 15 years. He was convicted by a federal jury in 1942 and went to federal prison. I mark that as the technical end of slavery in America.
The records are incomplete, but it's estimated that in the 80 years following the Civil War, as many as 800,000 people had faced the South's corrupt system of justice. Huge numbers of those arrested were forced into involuntary servitude. Some, including Viola Cosley's son, Marion, found freedom. On January 7, 1943, he enlisted as a private in the U.S. Army, one of more than 2.5 million African Americans who registered for service during the Second World War.
My boy entered an advertisement.
I should mention that African Americans, even before we were African Americans, have always been among the first to sign up to fight for freedom. We think of Crispus Attucks, who fought in the Revolutionary War. We think of the Hellfighters, who fought in World War I, or the 54th Regiment, who fought in the Civil War. We think of the Tuskegee Airmen, who fought in World War II. We think of the Vietnam War. We think of all the wars that this country has ever been engaged in. African Americans have been among the first to raise their hand to fight for freedom. So when people say, well, go back where you came from, or we want to take our country back, those kinds of insane statements being made shows a sign of ignorance, because they don't understand that this country is an amalgamation of all different people from various countries from all over the world. This is what makes America great. So the whole Juneteenth commemoration, it helps to highlight one segment of the African population of how this country is just as much their country as it is any other person's country who came from other parts of the world. I often tell students that as African Americans came over on different ships, different circumstances, but we're all in the same boat now as it relates to how one should be treated. I think that as we become more educated, and there is an aversion right now, just as the founding fathers and the early planters wanted to divide and conquer, part of that dividing and conquering meant keeping part of the poor Europeans ignorant. As long as you are ignorant and you don't understand what's going on, you are a prime suspect for being exploited. So we see now there's an aversion to eliminate certain books, to not read books by W.E.B. Du Bois, to not read books by Langston Hughes, to not read history to understand exactly what happened. Because if you're ignorant, you can be controlled. And that has been the case, which is why I think these kinds of lectures that we're doing this morning are so important, because hopefully we can't cover 400 years in an hour, but hopefully I can give you enough information that will hopefully whet your appetite so that you can do further research. I would ask again that you read, that you can go online and look up the documentary Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. Please write that down. Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. I will stop now, and I will entertain questions that some of you may have, and we'll go from there. But again, thank you so much for having me. I've done about 50 of these lectures since January, so I enjoy talking to students, faculty, and staff, and anyone who's willing to listen. And like most professors, I never met a microphone I didn't like, so I can talk for days. So I'll stop at this point, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that some of you may have.
Dr. McCurdy, I have questions for you from our audience. And the first one says, this is very enlightening. I wondered if you could explain if the Africans were complicit in selling their own people, and if so, how and why did this come about?
And the answer is yes. There were tribal wars, civil wars within Africa. And often there would be people who would be captured, who would be prisoners of war from another plantation. From another tribe, and they would sell their brothers and sisters into slavery in exchange for weapons or some other goods. My sense is they did not know what was going to happen to their African brothers and sisters. They did not understand what their fate would end up being. I would like to believe that if they had any idea that they were going to be sold into slavery and being put on a ship and shipped to the Americas, they probably would not have done it. I don't know, but to answer the question, it just did happen.
Thank you. Next question. You noted that your parents protected you from racist environments. When did you start learning about the realities you have shared today? How do you suggest that interested audience members begin their journey to learn if they have not heard this information previously?
Very good question. As I mentioned, it became apparent to me when I was about 6 or 7 years old that my complexion would put me in a different category of being respected. So, like sitting in the doctor's office or whether I use the word African American, but at that time it was called the colored waiting room. That was my first experience. And throughout my professional life, I mean, I have only taught at predominantly white institutions, and I've seen, and I continue to see the disparity between how certain faculty members are hired. I've seen how those who are hired, how their dossiers are overlooked in terms of promotions and tenure. I've seen how certain students who apply to institutions are sometimes denied. So race has been a part of our society from day one. And my thinking is, for those who want to learn, you have to read, you have to immerse yourself with this information. The readings of James Baldwin, the readings of Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Amiri Baraka, A.K. Leroy Jones. I think you have to immerse yourself in that kind of information to really get an understanding of how we as a country have dealt with this tango dance of dealing with race. It's always the pink elephant in the room. It is. I mean, I'll give you an example. Right now, we're here at USC and we're dealing with how certain faculty are not hired. And even though we espouse the notion of dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is why I take my role so seriously, and I find myself being the one who will speak up. We were having a search committee for a position here, and we had a very gifted African American candidate. And in our wrap-up meeting, one of my colleagues said, "This guy's too good to be true. We need to find out if he is who he says he is." And I stopped. I said, I'll just use the name Bob. Bob, did you hear what you just said? Do you understand that's dare I say it, an explicit example of bias? You offered no caveat. You didn't say, well, because he's young or because he's from this part of the country. You just simply said, this person's too good to be true. So those kinds of implicit biases exist all the time. So I think I always tell my white colleagues, we need for you to exercise your white privilege. When you see or experience things that you know are wrong, you got to speak up. You have to say something. You can't. Your silence is complicity. When you don't say anything, in many ways you are just as guilty as the person who said those dreadful words. So to answer the question, I think we have to educate ourselves. We have to read. If you're a white person, you have to read. You have to understand the vicissitudes that African Americans and other people of color experience, but predominantly African Americans, because I think we probably more so than any other marginalized group have, other than our Native American brothers and sisters, have really felt the brunt of what it means to be considered an other. Okay, next question.
Okay. The questions are rolling in and we have less than 5 minutes to go. So,
okay. I'll give shorter answers from now on.
No, you're okay. I just want the audience to know. I can't, we don't have time for them all to be answered. Thank you, Dr. Mccurdy. Hopefully those individuals who have been given the information will pass it onward. It will be up to those who have ancestors who colonized to teach their young. Even we as African Americans must teach our young. For the information has been swept under the rug, under the carpet, not just the rug, far too long. So that was a statement. I do have, but I thought it was, let's see. How do you incorporate history into your lessons as a professor of music to USC students or any of the programs such as Disney where you have been involved? Please give examples of how any classroom or learning experience could incorporate lessons about Juneteenth or emancipation.
Very good question. My thinking is when we teach history, African American is American history. American history incorporates African American history. So for example, in music, I had one colleague say, well, we should have a Black composers concert. I go, no, we should have a concert that includes Black composers' music. We should have a women's concert. No. We should have a concert that includes compositions by female composers. So rather than patronize a certain ethnic group or a certain gender, let's include, when we're talking about history, all aspects of history. What I've done in my role as assistant dean, I've spoken with my colleagues about programming for our large ensembles, orchestra, wind ensemble, choirs, that they include compositions by African American composers as part of their normal programming. In courses that deal with other academic subjects, like in my class happens to be the music of Black Americans, so that class is already built in to talk about African American contributions. But I implore my colleagues to what we call decolonize our curriculum. Because again, as I said earlier, our curriculum was based on white supremacy, where we only study dead white composers. We only study Shakespeare. We don't study W.E.B. Du Bois. We don't study Langston Hughes. Those topics are excluded from the curriculum. So I ask students and faculty, my colleagues, to expand their horizons by looking at other examples or other topics that they can include in their instructions.
Thank you. The final question, Dr. McCurdy, do you have a final message for our audience?
Yes, I do. That message would be, everyone can take responsibility for ensuring that we as a country are moving in the right direction. Right now, we are a very polarized country. We had a former president who had some things, who preyed upon white grievance. He did exactly what the early planters did by dividing and conquering, by preying on white grievance, by saying they're going to take your jobs, they're murderers, they're rapists, they're all these things. And all that does is divide us. I think when we can look and see the similarities that we share, because we all want our kids to be safe. We all want to grow up and be a part of what we call this American dream. We want to lead comfortable lives where we can grow and prosper and see our children grow up and become great citizens. We all want the same thing. So why should one population have it and another population should not have it? We have to ask ourselves that question. And again, I would say again to my white colleagues, you have to share your white privilege. You have to speak up. You have to do that. And I would say, for everyone, the most important thing is to educate yourselves, to read. You know, for me, I became obsessed with this when my first job was at Kansas. I was just doing music courses. I didn't deal with any kind of history at all, and I must admit I was a little oblivious to this information myself. When I moved to the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, I taught this class for the first time, Music of Black Americans, and I had a student ask me the question, well, Dr. McCurdy, do you think that the dancers were influenced by the musicians and poets of the Harlem Renaissance? And I didn't know. I was like, what do you think? I don't know. But what it did, it forced me to immerse myself in this history. And so all that I do, when I create art right now, my scholarship supports my artistic endeavors and vice versa. So I would encourage all of you just to immerse yourselves in this, to read as much as you possibly can, go to as many seminars as you possibly can. And I do want to thank you all this morning for coming. I know you had other options other things you could have done. And I'm so grateful that you chose to spend this hour with me and being a part of this presentation. I do want to thank MCC for inviting me, and I look forward to working with you all again in the future and hopefully coming to your campus in person like I did several years ago to spend some time with you in person. I would love to do that again. So again, thank you all. I know our time is fleeting, so I will stop talking right now.
Thank you, Dr. McCurdy. Let's see. Please complete the online evaluation. It should be in the chat for you. And this evening we have another Juneteenth activity, and it will be hosted at 6:30 p.m. today, a virtual lecture by a local pastor, Reverend T. Michael Williams, who is also the president of the Omaha NAACP and pastor of Mount Moriah Baptist Church. As Dr. McCurdy indicated, you could have been several different places in person or virtually. We're happy that you have spent the last hour with us learning about Juneteenth. In addition, we have some activities on Thursday as well. So we hope to see you again, and please share the information with your colleagues, friends, family members. Take care and have a great afternoon.